Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've always been known as a bit of a daredevil among my friends and family. Ever since I was a kid, I was the one jumping off the highest diving board, riding my bike down the steepest hills, and generally seeking out anything that would give me an adrenaline rush. My older brother used to joke that I was born with a lead foot, and honestly, he wasn't wrong. I just enjoyed pushing boundaries and seeing what I could get away with. By the time I turned 18, most of my friends already had their licenses and were driving around town. I kept making excuses about why I hadn't gotten mine yet, but the truth was that my parents wanted me to take professional lessons first. They knew about my reckless streak and figured formal instruction might help me develop better habits behind the wheel. My dad had actually been teaching me to drive in empty parking lots and quiet back roads for months, so I wasn't completely clueless about operating a vehicle. The driving school my parents chose had a decent reputation in our town. When I walked in for my first lesson, I was buzzing with excitement and nerves all tangled up inside me. That's when I first laid eyes on her. A middle-aged woman with a permanent scowl etched on her face and a vibe that screamed superiority. I introduced myself politely and told her I was there for my driving lesson. She barely looked at me when she said she was my instructor and immediately started barking orders about how I better listen carefully and do exactly what she said if I wanted to pass the test. Right from the start, her tone rubbed me the wrong way, but I figured maybe she was just being professional, so I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. We walked out to the car and she started explaining the basics: mirrors, seat position, pedals, standard stuff that I already knew, but I kept my mouth shut and nodded along. The moment we started driving, though, her true colors came out. Every tiny mistake I made was met with some cutting remark or sarcastic comment. I accidentally let the car drift slightly toward the center line, and she immediately told me that I couldn't stay in my lane and that her grandmother could do better even though she'd been dead for 5 years. I was trying to parallel park between two cones, which honestly seemed pretty advanced for a first lesson, and when I didn't get it perfect on the first try, she just shook her head in disgust. She called my driving pathetic and said I was driving like a toddler with a tricycle. She even said she was shocked I had made it to my age without someone else having to hold my hand through everything. The worst part was that she seemed to enjoy tearing me down. Every criticism came with this smug little smile, like she was getting some kind of sick pleasure from making me feel stupid. I tried to stay focused on learning, but her constant negativity was making it impossible to concentrate. After about 20 minutes of this treatment, I decided I'd had enough. The next time she made one of her snide comments, I turned to her and told her that I understood she was trying to be thorough, but we'd probably learn better if she was a little more supportive. I suggested constructive criticism instead of just insulting me. She asked me if I was questioning her teaching methods and reminded me that she'd been doing this for 15 years. She said she didn't need some punk kid telling her how to do her job. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to tell her how to do her job, just that maybe we could work together instead of her just pointing out everything I was doing wrong. She shot back that this wasn't a partnership and that she was the instructor while I was the student. She made it clear that I didn't get to have opinions about how she taught. That attitude right there was what really set me off. The entitlement, the condescension, the complete dismissal of treating me like a human being. I could feel my daredevil side starting to kick in, and I began forming a plan. For our second lesson the following week, I had done some research on the local roads. I knew exactly where I wanted to take her. When we got in the car, I started off being extra polite and compliant, following her instructions to the letter. I figured if I buttered her up a bit, she might be more willing to let me practice on different types of roads. I told her I'd been thinking about what she said last week about needing more challenging driving situations. I suggested we try that hill road over on Maple Street because I'd heard it was good practice for new drivers. She seemed pleased and said that finally I was showing some sense. She agreed that hills were important and that real drivers needed to know how to handle all kinds of terrain. Perfect! She was taking the bait. When we drove toward the hill, I kept up the act of being the reformed, eager student. I asked questions about proper hill driving technique and nodded seriously at her answers. She was clearly enjoying having what she thought was a respectful, intimidated student. The road I had chosen was pretty steep, with a long downhill stretch that leveled out at the bottom. Nothing dangerous, but definitely enough to get your heart pumping if you took it too fast. When we approached the crest of the hill, I could feel that familiar adrenaline rush building up. She started explaining that when we went down the hill, I needed to maintain steady pressure on the brake pedal. She told me not to ride the brakes, but also not to let the car build up too much speed. I nodded and said I understood about steady pressure and controlling the speed. But when we started down the hill, I had very different plans. Instead of gently applying the brakes like she'd instructed, I pressed down on the gas pedal. The car immediately started picking up speed, and I could feel us accelerating down the slope. She immediately started asking what I was doing and telling me to slow down. Her voice was getting more urgent when she kept repeating for me to slow down. I just grinned and pressed the accelerator a little harder. The speedometer was climbing and I could hear her voice getting more panicked. She was yelling at me to stop it and hit the brakes right now. She asked if I was completely insane. The car was really flying now, and I could see her gripping the door handle with white knuckles. She was genuinely terrified. Part of me was enjoying her fear, but I wasn't actually planning to hurt anyone. I had driven this road before with my dad, and I knew exactly when I needed to start braking to bring us to a safe stop. Just when we reached the bottom of the hill, I slammed on the brakes hard. The car came to a screeching halt, and the sudden stop threw us both forward against our seatbelts. Karen was hyperventilating, and when I looked over at her, I could see tears in her eyes. I apologized sarcastically and said it seemed like I had confused the gas pedal with the brake pedal. I suggested that maybe my instructor should have taught me the difference better. That's when I noticed that her pants were completely soaked. She had literally wet herself from fear. For a moment, I actually felt bad about what I'd done, but then I remembered how she'd been treating me, and the guilt faded pretty quickly. Karen was shaking and could barely speak. She managed to pull out her phone and call someone from the driving school. She told them she needed someone to come pick us up immediately because there had been an incident and she couldn't continue the lesson. She wouldn't even let me drive back to the school. We sat there in awkward silence for about 15 minutes until another instructor showed up to collect us. Karen got out of the car without saying a word to me and climbed into the other vehicle. I drove back with the replacement instructor who kept asking what had happened. When we got back to the driving school, I was called into the office to explain myself. The manager was clearly concerned about liability and wanted to know exactly what had gone wrong. The manager said that my instructor reported there had been some kind of incident during the lesson and asked me to tell him what happened. I explained that this was only my second driving lesson ever, and I guessed I got confused about which pedal was which. I said I meant to brake going down the hill but accidentally hit the gas instead, and that it was completely unintentional. The manager said that was a pretty serious mistake and asked if I was sure there wasn't anything else going on. I insisted there was nothing else and that I was still learning, so I made a mistake. I pointed out that was why I was there taking lessons, to learn how to drive properly. The manager seemed satisfied with my explanation, though he did mention that they'd be assigning me a different instructor going forward. When my dad came to pick me up, he could tell something had happened just from looking at my face. My dad asked what I had done. I insisted I hadn't done anything, and that I just made a mistake with the pedals. He said he was sure and supposed this mistake had nothing to do with the fact that my instructor was apparently so shaken up that she had to go home for the day. He didn't buy my story for a second, but after giving me a lecture about responsibility and the potential results of my actions, he decided to let it slide with just a warning. My new instructor turned out to be a much better fit. He was patient, encouraging, and actually seemed to enjoy teaching. We got along great, and I ended up passing my driving test on the first try a few weeks later. I met my husband during a particularly rough patch in my life. I was 24, working at a local diner, and feeling pretty lost about where my life was heading. My family had always been critical of my choices, especially my mother, who had this way of making me feel like I could never do anything right. When I met him at the farmer's market where he was selling vegetables from the farm where he worked, something just clicked. He was kind, funny, and actually listened to me without judgment. Our relationship moved fast. We both knew within a week that we wanted to be together, but we dated for a full year to make sure it wasn't just infatuation. My family hated him from the start. They thought we hadn't been together long enough to get married, and they looked down on him because he worked as a farmhand. When I brought him to a family gathering, my uncle actually offered to bury him in the back 40 for me. It was humiliating and cruel. That's when we decided to just go to the courthouse and elope. Simple, cheap, and drama-free. But my mother had other plans. She started pressuring me about having a real wedding. Every phone call, every visit, she'd bring it up. She kept saying I couldn't just run off to some courthouse like I was ashamed of each other and asking what people would think. I tried to explain that we weren't ashamed and just wanted something simple, but she insisted I was being selfish. She told me she'd been dreaming of planning my wedding since I was a little girl. Eventually, my husband and I talked about it and figured a small ceremony wouldn't hurt. We were thinking maybe 20 people max, somewhere natural like a park or woodland area. We didn't have much money and neither of our families offered to help financially. When I suggested a park ceremony, my mother immediately shot it down. She said absolutely not and insisted we have it in the backyard because it would be easier for everyone. I tried to tell her we really wanted somewhere more natural and pretty, but she dismissed the idea completely. She said she wasn't driving all over creation for some outdoor nonsense. So the backyard it was. Then we picked a date that worked for both our families. My mother immediately said that date wouldn't work because she had already bought tickets to a quilt show that weekend. I reminded her that we'd already told everyone, but she said I'd just have to change it because the quilt show was important to her. This pattern continued for months. Every decision we made, she'd find a reason to change it. Every time I tried to push back, she'd start crying and get my father involved. He'd come to me looking exhausted and tell me to just make my mom happy, saying it would make her so happy if I just did this one thing. Dad always looked so tired when he said it. He was a genuinely kind man, but my mother had worn him down over the years. I kept giving in because I felt bad for him, not her. When the wedding was still several months away, I suggested we have a stag and do party to raise money for the celebration. For those who don't know, it's a public party where people buy tickets to help the bride and groom raise money for their wedding. They have games, music, dancing, and lots of drinks. My husband and I thought it would be perfect since we were keeping the actual ceremony small. My mother immediately said absolutely not. She told me you have to have friends for that kind of thing and said no one would want to go to my stag and do. When I asked what she meant and pointed out that we had friends, she said my extended family would never go to something like that and his family lived hours away. It would never come to anything so trivial. She kept going on about how embarrassing it would be, how no one would show up, how pathetic it would make us look. I was so depressed by her words that I gave up on the idea entirely. I felt like complete trash. The thing is, I had no idea what I was doing when it came to weddings. My mother was the only person I could ask for advice, and deep down, I kept hoping that maybe this time she'd actually put me first and we could bond over planning something special together. I was naive. I wanted to save money on a cake by baking one myself. I actually enjoy baking and thought it would be fun. My mother immediately said no and told me she'd already told my aunt that she could make the cake. She said the aunt was so excited about it. I tried to explain that I wanted to make it myself, but she told me not to be ridiculous because the aunt was already planning it. The aunt she chose was her alcoholic sister-in-law who was incredibly insecure. The cake turned out fine, just a simple vanilla sheet cake, but the aunt kept accusing me of not liking it. Later I found out my mother had told her I hated it, which I absolutely didn't. Then came dress shopping. I'm not a skinny woman. I'm curvy and thick in all the right places, which means finding clothes that fit properly is challenging. I was planning to get a nice sundress from a plus-size store, something I could wear again. My mother got very excited and said she knew the perfect place to take me. She was thrilled that now she could tell all her friends that she helped pick out my dress. Despite my protests about wanting to shop at a plus-size store, she insisted on taking me to a wedding dress shop 4 hours away. The moment we walked in, the saleswoman looked me up and down and bluntly told us they didn't carry anything in my size and she didn't know who did. I was mortified. My mother thought it was hilarious and laughed at me the entire drive home. She told me that wedding dresses are for skinny women, so I'd either need to lose weight or do something else. She refused to go anywhere else after that. A week later, I bought a simple lavender dress from a kiosk in the mall and told her she'd have to deal with it. I was done trying to please her. My husband was furious with me for letting things get so out of control, but by then the wedding was only a week away. We'd already given my father money for the party, which was going to be a potluck barbecue with surprise pizza and beer. We decided to just write it out. We didn't want a priest or pastor, just a justice of the peace. My dad said he knew someone and had us covered. The day before the wedding, we were introduced to a sketchy-looking pastor who handed us a piece of paper with the ceremony my mother had picked out for us. In the middle of it was the most inappropriate, bizarre poem I'd ever heard. My husband and I locked eyes and had to stifle our laughter. My mother was thrilled and said it was perfect. She was excited that now she could tell everyone that she picked the ceremony too. The day of the wedding arrived, and my husband's family showed up in the morning, his parents and 2 brothers. The ceremony was supposed to be at noon, with a party for everyone else the next day. I was dressed in my lavender dress, but my mother was nowhere to be seen. I asked my dad where she was, and he quietly muttered that she went to a quilt show and wouldn't be back until that night. A quilt show on my wedding day? But it gets worse. The night before, she had secretly told the pastor that the ceremony wasn't until evening, leaving us completely in the dark. So we waited around with my husband's family, laughing at how absurd it all was. 6 o'clock rolled around and the pastor showed up ready for business. My mother arrived 20 minutes later, laughing about how we couldn't start until she had a shower and got dressed. I told her that this had been totally unacceptable. I explained that she knew when it was supposed to be, and she purposely decided to disrespect not only me and my husband, but also his family. She just said I was being ungrateful. We all stood in awkward silence until she came out ready. I looked at her and said something I would normally never say. I asked if we were allowed to start now, if she needed a snack, and if she had gone to the bathroom first. She looked embarrassed and gave me a fake smile, saying it was fine. The pastor started the ceremony, and when he got to that ridiculous poem, just the way we'd predicted, all the brothers lost it. We all burst into hysterical laughter. My mother was furious and hissed at us to stop laughing, but we couldn't stop. It was the best thing that had happened all day. Even my dad and my husband's parents were roaring with laughter. After the ceremony was done, my mother went to sulk in her room. How dare we have fun at our own wedding? The party the next day was amazing. We did everything we could think of to have fun, despite my mother constantly trying to get me to hide away from the celebration. She literally tried to get me to clean the house and do dishes while the party was going on so she could mingle and drink. I told her no way, because it was my wedding party. I shotgunned a tall can of beer right in front of her with my husband's cousin and suggested we all have a big bonfire to end the night. My mother huffed and dragged my poor father into the house to yell at him about it. She came back after a while and sat at the fire with a fake smile, then started telling embarrassing stories about my childhood. Not the cute, funny kind, but the traumatic, humiliating kind that you don't share with people you barely know. My husband and I were pretty tipsy by then and decided that since most of the family was either leaving or going to bed, we'd round up whoever wanted to go to the local bar. Everyone was tired, so my husband and I walked to the bar in our wedding clothes. It was perfect. We told the whole town about our marriage. I met old school teachers, classmates, and even the former mayor. We didn't have to pay for drinks the rest of the night and played darts and pool with everyone there. When we got back at 3 in the morning, we cleaned up everything from the party and started up the campfire again to cook breakfast. We got to hear about how cringy my mother had been after we left and how my husband's aunt had told her off on her way to bed. That whole experience made me realize that my entitled mother would never change. She would always put herself first and disrespect me in the process. After the wedding, I gradually went no contact with her for 10 years. We finally started talking again recently, but this time I set the boundaries. I decide when we talk, what we talk about, and how long the conversations last. There isn't a thing she can do about it because I finally learned that just because someone is family doesn't give them the right to treat you badly. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.